Fred, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today.
Pleasure.
We are thrilled to have you with us. You have so much to share with us. We have such a short period of time. We should start right away. You were born in December 1932, just weeks before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Before you tell us what happened to you under the Nazis and during World War II and the Holocaust, let's first have you tell us a little bit about your family and their life before Hitler came to power. What was their life like?
Why, my mother was born in April 1906 of well-to-do family. She attended a finishing school on the border with Switzerland, and my father was sent to one day take her home to Wiesebvaden, and 2 years after that my father married my mother when she was 18 years old and he was 28 years old. This was now 1924, and at that time Germany had a democratic government. Between 1924 until I was born, my mother and father had a very comfortable life. My father was a businessman, and unfortunately his father-in-law died of kidney cancer 2 months after they had married. So that's about it.
Your father had served in the German army in World War I, right?
Correct. Yeah. My father, his own father actually died when he was only 14 years old. He was born in 1896. But during World War I, my father volunteered with the German army. He got wounded. He was a machine gunner, and he got wounded in the Battle of Verdun in France. So he was awarded the Iron Cross, one of the highest medal of that time of the German army, by the future president of Germany, Marshal Hindenburg.
One last question before we move on. How large was your extended family?
Well, the interest, quite a bit, because our own immediate family, I had only, after my older sister died when she was only about a few months old, and I had another younger brother who also died, so it was only two of us with our parents.
So you had an older brother, Hans, right?
Hans was 5 years older.
And did you have a larger extended family?
Correct. We had the name of the maiden name of my mother was Grünebaum. Her mother was, today's my grandmother, which was going to stay with us for a long time, was Ketchen with the maiden name of Scheuer Barnes. On the other side, for the Kahn side, the Jacob Kahn was my grandfather. He was born in 1855 in a small village in Germany called Hausen über Aar. And while I was on the internet years ago, I corresponded with somebody from Hausen über Aar who happened to live next door to where my grandfather had been born, and found his grave. And I'm still in contact with him. He's now a professor of geography.
Fred, it wasn't long after Hitler came to power in early 1933 that your father decided to leave Germany for Belgium. What do you know about your father's decision to leave that early, and why he went without the rest of the family at that time?
Well, my father was never involved in politics, but he kept up with the news, and he thought that Hitler would not last more than a couple of years. And that's why also at the time the brown shirts, which was like a private army of Hitler, of the Nazis, was attacking Jews and some killing them in Wiesebvaden. And they threw stones through the windows, and they in fact had a national boycott day against Jewish business on April the 1st, 1933. And of course, a month later, you probably heard about they burned the books. So that in September, my father went to, under the guise of that he was traveling because he had to sign out, my mother did that, he went to Belgium, hoping that Hitler naturally would be gone by the time he'll come back. But that did not happen. And so my mother and my brother and my grandmother joined my father in Belgium.
And your mother went first, and then your grandmother went with your brother, and then
Right,
your grandmother
right,
went a little bit
right.
later.
Because they had two buildings there that they owned, and she had to sell it first.
By the time your mother and grandmother and brother had left, you were left with your aunt and uncle.
Correct.
Tell us, and you would stay with them until 1938.
Yeah, October 38.
Tell us what that time, as best you know, knowing you were very young, what was that time like for you living with your aunt and uncle?
Well, they're very, very, very loving because they were childless. And all I remember is a lot of hugs. They really, truly loved me. And I went on sleigh rides, and I had a boyfriend my age who was not Jewish, Walter. In fact, Walter was so close to me that one day the other kids that were children of German soldiers that had been stationed in the town where I lived there, of Lejeune, ran after me and threw stones after me and called me dirty Jew. We ran, Walter and I, through the alley and asked him, in German, of course, that's the only language I knew, he said, "Was ist ein Jude?" You know, what is a Jew? Because I didn't know that. To me, I was only, probably 4 or 5 years old. That's it.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes, of course, I was naughty. I slept with a dog in a hut, and they were looking all over town for me, and they eventually found me sleeping there with a dog in a doghouse. And And one day I was very inquisitive. I went up in the attic and I looked through. I was climbing up to see, how you would see the place from there. But fortunately, my aunt was right behind me and she grabbed me. And of course, I got spanked.
Do you know if you had any contact with your mother and father during that time with your aunt and uncle?
Occasionally, my mother, then, who was in Belgium, would come. People did not fear at the time, at least Jewish people, in 1933 to 38, something would happen to women or children, Jewish children. They knew that men would be, most likely interned. But my mother occasionally would come, and I did not know that she was my mother. I remember thinking, who's that woman? Is she a friend? She had black hair. And and she hugged me. I remember the hugs of my early years very much.
So as far as you were concerned, your aunt and uncle were like your parents at
Correct.
that time?
Absolutely. I called my, I don't remember what I called my uncle, but I called my aunt Mama. Even when later on I was taken to Belgium, the telephone call I made to her, I yelled and cried, "Mama," and I had a lot of tears. So I considered her my mother.
During that time with your aunt and uncle, I believe they lost their business. It was taken away from them during that time?
Right, in 1935, they had they were selling meat and sausages, and it was closed.
The Nazis closed it.
Right, right.
Yeah. You also shared with me that while you were there, your paternal, I believe your paternal grandmother died. And
that was, during around 12 o'clock each day, there were two brothers who married two sisters and who lived in the same, not far away from each other. My grandmother, on my paternal side, lived with the other sister of my aunt, which was also my aunt. And I would take my grandmother, walk her from one of the sisters to the other sisters. And in fact, when both sisters were quarreling with each other, I was a go-between. So I was very close to this grandmother. Unfortunately, in June the 1st, 1938, she died.
And you were with her, right?
Yeah, right. And she fell down and she died. But I remember where she was buried, because a year after, around that time, the Nazis forbid Jews to have a gravestone.
So your grandmother had no tombstone.
No tombstone. But I remembered where she was buried.
During that time, what were your parents doing in Belgium? Were they getting established?
Well, my father became, he was a businessman. He had to restart all over again. But then he became a bridge player. And as a result, he got to know a lot of people, especially from the Belgian establishment. And that would be I tell my wife, it is eventually, when we went into hiding, this was thanks to the bridge connection, because they considered my father not like a German, but a Belgian, like them.
And a fellow bridge player.
Fellow bridge player, right.
Your move to join your parents in 1938, in October of 1938, was sudden. Tell us what precipitated you going to Belgium and what was involved in getting you there.
Right. Most of you probably know about the Munich Pact that gave away a part of Czechoslovakia to the Nazis. When this happened, the agreement was signed September 30th. The next day, my father called his sister, let's get the boy out of Germany. Because my father thought they would close the border and eventually there would be war. In fact, he was right, because 11 months later, World War II started in Europe. Before, I was taken to the city of Aachen and turned over to a lady. There was a synagogue next to our house, and during the night, I never could understand it, but I was with them when they buried the religious relics of this synagogue in a landfill.
And you were actually with them for that,
Yeah,
right?
correct. And I never, I'm still trying to figure out the reason why they wanted me there. So that the next morning my uncle took me, and as we walked out of the courtyard, I was turning over to and I remember that very well, I want to say goodbye to my friend Walter. Yeah. But of course, that's the last thing that my uncle wanted to let people know, that I'm leaving. So he said he's already in the field. And so he took me by train to the city border from Wiesbaden, which is near Frankfurt, to the town of Aachen.
Fred, before you tell us about that, when you were told that you're going to leave, did you realize that you were now going to move away from your aunt and uncle and go to your parents?
Well, they just told me that I was going to take a big trip.
You're just going to take a big
trip. They didn't go into any details.
Okay. And the landfill where the religious relics were buried, turned out that...
No, the landfill was just up the street.
Right. And in fact, that synagogue was burned shortly later.
Correct. 6 weeks later, there was Kristallnacht. Correct.
So now you're taken to Aachen.
Right.
All right.
And there, a friend of another uncle who lived then in Belgium, by the name of Fred Kahn, knew this lady there, Maria Goa, and somehow during the day that my father decided to get me out of Germany, he must have had a lot of phone calls, and obviously his brother told him he knows a person there in Aachen, a Christian lady, and my uncle who took me to her never knew her before. Do you understand? So that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. So she just was willing to take you across the border.
Correct, and because she was a friend of another uncle. And she took me by streetcar to the border with Germany, and then she told me in German, of course, it's the only language I knew then, that she has to go back, and she told me to walk through the no man's land to the Belgian border.
So this no man's land is like a space.
Yeah, it's
between
like
the two
a
countries.
one block between the Germany border and Belgium.
So she told you this little boy just
Right,
walked.
except I walked too slow. And so that, see, this was Saturday afternoon on October the 1st, and they expected that there would be a lot of movements of people who had worked over during the week in Germany or in Belgium. No one would notice me. But unfortunately, I walked very slowly, and I probably murmured something to myself. You know, what the lady was telling me about a party. I didn't know what that was, because I'd never known my father before, and I never saw any pictures of him. So by the time I arrived on the Belgian side, this man, of course, everybody's tall when you're young, and talked to me in French, but I didn't understand it. And then across the border's fence, there was another man yelling something which I didn't understand, but later on heard that he yelled, "That's my son," in French.
But you didn't know that was your father.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
And so after I know, bear in mind that my father was then 5 years in Belgium, and he was, through the bridge, had connections. They made probably some phone calls, and they let me in maybe 10, 15 minutes afterwards as a political refugee. I was short of 6 years old.
And considered a political refugee.
Correct.
So now you're in Belgium. Your family's reunited.
Right.
Your mother, your father, and your grandmother and your brother.
Correct.
You would live in Belgium for the next year until World War I broke out in September.
World War II.
September 1st, 1939. Some months later, 8 months later, in May 1940, the Germans invaded Belgium, along with France and Luxembourg. Tell us what you recall about the German invasion, and then what your family did once that happened.
Well, I recall this very well because my father had a friend in the Belgian army near the border, and he called at 5:30 in the morning on May the 10th to say that the Germans were just crossed the border. So my father decided, and it was on a Friday, I think, and a beautiful blue sky, I recall. And we had a car, a Ford car, so we all piled up in a car. And our direction, we thought, my father again, thought it would be like World War I, and that in the Flanders, the Belgian army and the English and the French would hold on, as they did in World War I.
So stop the German advance?
Right,
That's what he
but
thought.
we
Okay.
went to the Flanders, and eventually there were tons of refugees, and the German airplanes attacked the civilians in order to spread a panic there to prevent the advance of English and French soldiers. Even an English soldier, and then of course we had to jump from the car in the ditches, and probably some people got killed
So these were
because of the Stuttgarts.
Stuka, German fighter planes were
Yeah,
coming
it
in and
made
machine
like a
gunning.
siren, but it's because
Yeah.
of the air.
And you remember that?
Oh, yeah, very dangerous. You remember when people try to kill you. I mean,
Yep, I would think so.
yeah, it doesn't matter how old you are. And normally when people say, how can you remember that you are too young? I says, I give them that answer. And but then eventually the car broke down, and my father decided to go with other people in his parking lot to try to make it to Boulogne-sur-Mer and go to England.
Before you tell us about that, before the car broke down, tell us about the British soldier.
Oh,
Yeah.
As we drove, a British soldier asked to hitchhike with us. He was on a running board, and I recall that he sang, "It's a long way to Tipperary."
While he's riding on the running board.
Right. And then also we'll hang our dirty linen on the Siegfried line, which the Siegfried line was the German, they thought they're going to have a trench war again, and they built all, in France, they built the Maginot Line, and the Germans built the Siegfried Line.
So you ran out of gas, and now you set off
Right,
again.
and as a result, my mother was now in charge. And by that time...
Because your father's gone by this time?
Yeah, he's gone.
Where did he go?
He went to Boulogne-sur-Mer, where he tried to get to England and got there 24 hours too late. And Boulogne-sur-Mer is just next door to Dunkirk. And you have a movie just that came out about Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to make it with the English and the French to England, the same way as the over 300,000 Englishmen were rescued in Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And you know about the movie.
So now you're without your father, and your mother's in charge.
Right. Yep. And shortly thereafter, the same day, come down the hill, the German army. And I remember on an alley there was a French tank, and he just turned around, gone. And so we were going to stay in a house in a basement because the people had gone. And the German lieutenant told my mother then pretended that she was a Volksdeutscher, not that it means a German descended person. And he told her not to go in this house, it's not solid, go next door. And so all night long, I was in the basement. I recall there's like a thunder noise, they're shooting at each other. Mm-hmm. In the morning, when we got up, the house next door was destroyed. And we walk up the hill, kind of, I don't see how we would have gotten back to Brussels. And we walk up the hill, and I dropped a basket of eggs. But then on the left-hand side, I saw a German soldier look like he was asleep. He probably was dead. And suddenly, out of nowhere, came a bus with a Red Cross on it, and he stopped. And my mother again did a German Volksdeutsche with him, and he said, get on, and he took us to Brussels, where the German Red Cross fed me hot cocoa. And then after, from Brussels to Verviers, which is a city not too far from the German border, we hitchhiked back, and eventually we had split up. My grandmother and my brother went one way, and my mother and I. And so 6 weeks after we got back, my father came back to us. And
so he had spent that 6 weeks, was he still trying to get out?
To get to England, and he told me that he actually sabotaged some of the German phone lines or whatever.
But he made his way back and joined the family.
Yeah, he came back.
So now you're back reunited, you're living in Verviers.
Right.
Did you start going to school or anything
like
that?
Right. All along, the moment I got to Belgium, they put me in the kindergarten, and I met some young friends there, classmates, and I would remain friends with them the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. And now today, I'm still in contact through Facebook with their children. I'm just saying it now. Mm-hmm. Then eventually the first grade, and of course I was the last of the class. In the first grade I was 24 out of 24. Then somehow I found, and I showed you that my grade report card when I was in the third grade, and suddenly I was the third out of 20. But the last 2 months of the third grade, I got scarlet fever. And then eventually the Germans asked the Jews to register in City Hall and also to wear a yellow Star of David. When I returned to school in the fall of September after the third grade, we played in an intermission, and all the other kids, my friends, Belgian friends, appointed me as a sheriff, and they pretended to be cowboys or Indians. But one person called me dirty Jew in French. So I took my fist and hit him and broke his glasses. This looked very bad, but it was a turnabout, because it brought me to the principal. Well, the principal said, pay the glasses, and apologized. And the father of the young man was actually selling glasses. But then the principal said, I'm a patriot. I was a colonel in the First World War, and my son escaped to England with the Belgian Air Force. And he says, I will help you to go into hiding. Hiding meaning you conceal your identity and your whereabouts. As a result of that, maybe 2 years later, my father was walking in a city of Liège, and he sees this woman crying, and she tells him her husband, who was Jewish, was arrested by the Gestapo. So he came back on the train, and by that time I had already been trained as Freddie Lejeune, and also learned Catholic prayers such as Hail Mary and Our Father in Heaven.
So your parents had begun preparing
We
you.
were prepared, and also the brother of one of the bridge players told my father that he had a brother in the city hall, and as a result of it, they received forged identity paper in the name of people, Lejeune, of people who had actually lived at one time.
Before you changed your identities, I believe your father was arrested.
Yes, that was in 1941.
41.
My father was arrested, but then they threw him down in a basement of the Kommandatur, which is the headquarters of the SS, and tried to give him a hard time to find out who the story. They suspected, however, somebody of the same name, but who was a communist. And when they yelled at him, according to my father, he yelled right back, I'm a veteran of World War I. And it turned out, eventually they believed him, that they made a mistake. Max Kahn they were looking for was someone else. And that was 41. And then, of course, it added to because during that time, maybe a day or so that my father was arrested, my mother went out of her mind, of course. And that added to the anxiety of going into hiding.
So in 1942, you formally adopted the name of identities of Lejeune.
And the principal then, as I just mentioned, it was only about a couple of weeks earlier, the principal find us a place to live which would be safe, away from other houses near a forest. I remember, because for the short time we were there, I went and picked blueberries in the forest there. And then every few months we would move, so as not to arouse the suspicion of collaborators. A lot of people, unfortunately, they were denounced as either these people are Jewish. And of course we pretended that we were Christian and that we had been bombed out by the Americans.
And of course, during that time, the major deportations of Jews were taking place.
Right. On June the 9th, dated June the 9th, 1942, I received a postcard from my aunt, which I considered my mother, that they were going to be deported the next day to the east. And they were, my aunt asked my mother to take good care of me. Unfortunately, when we went into the underground, my mother destroyed anything that had our names on it. And she always regretted it later on that she didn't keep that postcard. But what happened is the following day, my aunt and uncle were deported to the extermination camp of Sobibor, and not a few months ago, through the German research outfit, the Fritz Bauer Institute, I learned that they were on transportation number D18, and that all the people were gassed on arrival.
And you
because they were over 50 years old.
And you just recently learned that.
Yeah, right. And also learned recently, as I told you, right here in a bookstore, a book called The Prisoners of Brandon, which is in Belgium. It was a transit camp, and when I took the book home, I looked at it, and I saw the picture of the same uncle that was a friend of the lady in Germany. And he, somebody in the books, was witnessed when he was selected to go to the gas chamber, because he was asked by Dr. Mengele, do you run? And honestly, he answered with difficulty. And then Mengele told him, go to the bus. And this other man, who was later on became a famous German journalist, answered, oh, I run very well. So he, Ernest Landau, survived working and being tattooed, was he learned later on that my uncle had been, that the bus took the people to the gas
And that was
chamber.
in the book that you just
That's
recently
in the
read.
book
Yeah.
that is here in the Holocaust bookstore.
Fred, you described that period of time moving frequently as the Lejeune family,
Right.
as that you were in what you
I
called...
was not in touch with any person of my own age. In other words, you want to become actually invisible. And the other point is that I want to emphasize, and this happens to all the Holocaust survivors, going through this kind of experience, you mature very fast. Of course, you don't have the insight of an adult, but you do you plan to, like an adult, not like a child. And then I had also the mission of taking care of my grandmother, who spoke only German. So at all times I had to be with her. And one time we were in a local train, and suddenly some German soldiers came in the compartment, and my grandmother panicked. She had in her bag, a purse maybe, a Belgian newspaper, and which was actually pro-German. But they didn't have any, in those days they had no pictures in the newspaper. And so she pretended she read the newspaper, hiding herself from the German. And then after we got off, and I told my grandmother, guess what? You were reading the newspaper upside down.
Fred,
So the humor helped us a lot.
and Fred, you described that as a very lonely time for you.
Oh yes, it was. I was very anxious all the time because of the fear. See, we're listening to the BBC in French, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and in already end of June 1942, they mentioned that the Germans were mass murdering the Jews in Russia. So we know very well that if we got caught, we would have been killed. There's no doubt about that. Of course, we did not go into hiding, as a vacation. We went there because it was about saving our lives. And so each day, for me, I was between the age of 10 and 12 years old, it was very stressful indeed. And I remember in 1943 that when I wandered to town, I was arrested by the Belgian police for not being in school, and in fact I had begged from them for some money to get on a bus, and it turns out to be a policeman. He took me to the police station, and they interrogated me, and I kept saying that my name, as I had been trained, Freddy Lejeune, and that I had, which is true, the scarlet fever, and I did not want to infect others, people.
Which is why you weren't in school.
Right. And however, they left me all alone. They took everything out of my pocket, and then afterwards, I was really expecting Germans to walk in, and they came back and asked me, is your mother blonde? And of course, my mother originally was black, but she turned herself blonde to pretend that she was Christian. And so they told me, you go out and don't you ever come back. And 6 years later, I would see them again, and they remembered that. But I told Mom, I never told my parents. And 6 years later, my mother found out about that story.
Fred, how did your parents manage to provide the essentials like food during that period?
Fortunately, we were well off. And my father, one of the bridge players again, he was a head of a bank. And so he turned all his money to the bank director. And you had to have really to trust somebody, Monsieur Laurent. And so, unfortunately, we had to buy everything in the black market because we had no ration card. Of course, we were not registered in the places where we live, even though the law said you have to register. With City Hall in Europe, you have to do that. When you move into a place or leave, you have to, be registered at City Hall. So we were really invisible. So therefore, and had to buy everything in a black market. And the most important thing we could get without spending money was potatoes. So my grandmother was cooking, and she did all creative, she created all kind of meals with potatoes. And of course, I love French fries. So that was great. But she made bread with potatoes and who knows what.
Fred, did anyone know your true identities?
No, right. I thought no one knew, but except years later, when somebody interviewed me from the Belgian newspaper, and then they put it on the radio. A older woman now thought I had died. One of the person who probably helped find us a different place to stay, he was a milk merchant, told her she was only 8 years old, that the Germans were going to try to kill me. It was very hard, as she wrote to me, for a young girl of 8 years old to understand why anybody would kill me. And that I learned that only long after, maybe 20 years ago.
In the fall of 1944, you've been living for 2 years as the Lejeune family, moving frequently,
Correct.
as you said. In the fall of 1944, after your family had moved to their final hiding place in the farming village of Onoutois, I believe it is.
Onoutois.
Near Spa, Belgium.
Right.
Belgium was liberated by
Right.
the Allies, although the war continued in Europe until May 1945. When did you realize that you could come out of hiding and be yourself?
We watched, all day long, we watched from the top of a field. You see, we lived on the top. The city of Theu was, and the owner was on top, was a farming village. And the bottom is Theu, which was a regular city, and then you have a slope, and so that if you could see across to the slope, and suddenly there was all this fighting. You heard that the noise, and it stopped, and then suddenly we saw tanks coming down with an orange thing on top of them, and my father now ran, just like that, boom, and my mother was so afraid that something would happen, but he ran and got across a bridge that had been blown up and greeted the American first tank. And that was how we were liberated.
And I think your father said that was the greatest day of his life.
Correct. When my parents, they came to the United States 15 years after I did, in 1967, and I told my wife that I told her what the answer my father would give, September 9th, 1944. So I asked him this question in front of my wife. Indeed, he answered September 9, 44.
And on that date, after that battle that you said raged all day long, and
Right.
finally when it was over, that in that town of Spa was a huge supply depot for the Germans.
Yeah, well, by that time, 3 months later, on my 12th birthday, we got word that the Germans had made a counter-offensive in what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge. It actually started on December 16th, and for 3 days it was radio silence. And we heard boom, boom, all that noise. And I saw, going up the hill, black soldiers with fixed bayonet, and I learned later on, this was the first time that black soldiers fought. They volunteered to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, and many got killed. You don't know? I'm afraid that many people, even American newspapers don't know about that. And some of the black soldiers got caught by the Germans and tortured and murdered. And I remember that to this day. And I'll tell you later more.
And you had thought you were liberated in
Oh
earlier.
yeah, of course, we had resumed our true identity. That's why it was so dangerous. And we walked in the snow, but it was a very cold winter, and we walked in the snow for the 15 miles to go to Liège and stayed in the basement. But it was the worst battle between the Americans and the British and the Germans. Each one lost a lot of people. And a lot of the American soldiers are buried in the Belgian cemetery of Henri Chapelle.
I like the incident you told me about when, after the fighting was over, the townspeople went to the German supplies and broke in.
Yeah, and there was a quartermaster there in the city of Tau, as I mentioned, and people, instead of greeting the American soldiers, went and, of course, got hold of all the goods there of the German armies, including a lot of Dutch cigars.
Which you gave to the American soldiers.
The next day, there were American troops who were passing in front of the house where we had lived, and I gave them those cigars, and in turn, they threw chewing gum and all sorts of stuff to us. I went back to the school to the city where I had lived, and the kids couldn't believe I was still alive. And I gave them some chewing gum.
Fred, the war would end in May 1945
Right.
With Germany's surrender. At what point, especially after you had thought you were safe, you resumed your identities, then the Battle of the Bulge began, you were again fearful that the Germans would come back. When did you and your parents actually feel that you were safe?
Well, after the war was over, of course. Mm-hmm. And my father resumed his business and played bridge again to the day until he came to the United States. And I remember when the war was over, I was walking up a hill and I heard the bells of the churches ringing all over the place, and it was the end of the war in May 1945. Then, a year later, I was in the 6th grade and I finished number 1 in a citywide exam. Here's a foreigner. Huh? But don't forget that during the war, and I didn't mention that the principal would come to us, not only found us a place to stay, but he brought me books in French. So I must have read a book a day. And so I finished first of a citywide exam. And then once I was in then the high school, I picked English as a first foreign language and also learned 4 years of Dutch. And of course I knew German. So by the time I came to the United States, I knew 4 languages. But then I got very active in youth activities. I created a soccer club and we competed. The neighborhood kids first got together, and then we competed to a championship of Belgium for 18 and under. In the first year we finished number 2, and finally in 1948, and I still have the cups which I showed Bill, we were champion of Belgium. And they couldn't believe it. The people who ran this whole thing couldn't believe that at that time I was only 15 or 16 years old, would do all that. And I still have the letter telling me how great I was.
Apropos to that, Fred, from what you've shared with me, after the war, you dived into life as fully as possible.
Right.
With your parents giving you what you said to me
Total
was
freedom.
total freedom.
Correct.
What did that mean to just have total freedom?
I learned later on when before my mother passed away and she was in contact with my wife, she said that my father had told her, don't bother the boys doing all right. So as a result of it, I hitchhiked all over between schools, in the summer. I would hitchhike all over Belgium, but I couldn't go outside of Belgium because I was a stateless citizen. And I wrote for the newspapers in French. I even, at the age of 17, I was walking by there and I see in those days they had the newspapers outside of the store, and I see my name in the front page of a newspaper on tolerance, indispensable condition of peace. And it's ironic that all these years after, I'm still promoting tolerance, right? Through the listserv that I'm managing.
Fred, your parents gave you total freedom, but they said you could not leave Belgium and go to the United States, which you wanted to do
until
you
I
finished
finished
high
school.
school.
Right. They insisted, of course, they insisted that I finish the school, which was excellent. It was like a prep school, and we learned about I was in humanities, and in economics was a major, and the teachers were federal, paid by the state. They were inspected, and I still remember most of their names. They were first rate.
Fred, what made you want to come to the United States, and how did you
Well, I
manage
had
to do that?
the brother and the sister that lived in the same town I was in, and where my grandmother had lived, left to New York in July 1938. And at first, my uncle in New York said he would pay my fare. Well, it turned out he didn't. I borrowed the money. And then of relatives, which I actually didn't know. A first cousin who provided the affidavit support. You had to have that to become to the United States as a legal citizen. The affidavit of support meant they would pay that I would never be in charge of the American government. And they had a business, whereas my uncle maybe did not. And so I had an obligation to go to Baltimore. And so I became a resident of Baltimore. The moment I arrived there, they got me a job as a stock clerk. And in the evening, I found myself a job as an usher in a movie, Avalon. And I met there a future movie director, Levinson, who made a lot of movies. The Diner and Avalon also.
Barry Levinson.
He was at my age.
One last question for now, Fred, because our time is getting short.
Right.
And there's so much.
You know, I don't mind. I watch this program.
I'm watching it. There's so much you could share with us after coming to the United States, of course, that we don't have time for. But you joined the Army. You were in Army intelligence.
Right.
And you went back to Germany. What was that like to go back to
Well,
Germany?
I arrived there in Germany, and the first thing, of course, I want to go back to where I had been reared. It was near Easter or Passover, and I went to the commander, and I found the chaplain, and of course that's the only time you need it. And I told him my story, and so they gave me 3-day pass. I went and I arrived in Wiesebvaden in a train, and my father would come from Belgium, and I told the train master.
He met you in Wiesbaden?
In Wiesbaden, yeah, right. Okay. And I told the train master, I says, ich war hier geboren, means I was born here. And the train master answered, of course, I must have had an English accent. He said, nein. And then afterwards, about 3 months later, don't forget, I was in intelligence, and we did not wear our uniform in public, and the German people would not believe that I was an American soldier. How about that?
Fred, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from our audience before you close out our program.
Right.
So should we see if we can get a question or two? We have a microphone in each aisle. If you have a question, we ask that you use the microphone. Make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat it just to be sure that we hear it right before Fred answers. So anybody have a question? The gentleman right there raising his hand.
Sir, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service to this country. One of the major elements of the Jewish faith is the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah. How were bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs handled during that horrific time in your life?
Yeah, I never had a bar mitzvah as a result of it. And also where we lived, in Verviers, we never knew only one family who was half Jewish. Sort of, the husband was Jewish, and the wife was German, and she protected him. But there was no synagogue there, and of course during the war, I was never bar mitzvah. And my father and mother were not religious, but although my grandmother, she had the Bible, I mean the Torah, and she refused to give it up, and she read the Bible every single day.
So she had it during the whole time you were...
Yes, and I still have it. That book religious book dates back to 1850. Right. But as a result, I never, I was not, my wife she was Buddhist, she turned into Jewish, she learned Hebrew, and she sings at the Bethel congregation here in Bethesda. But I believe in God very much so, but not...
All right.
No.
Do we have another question?
Well, we forget about something.
We're not forgetting about it. Yeah, I promise.
Yeah, right.
One last question, because we're not going to forget about that. Let me just say that afterwards, Fred's going to go sign copies of the Fred Kahn story. That will also be an opportunity to ask Fred some additional questions if you want. So, sir? Yeah.
Fred, thanks very much for your presentation. I'm from Australia, and I'm really, what struck me was you were the beneficiary of asylum. And
Of what?
You were a beneficiary of asylum.
And the beneficiary of being received into countries to protect you and your family. What sort of messages do you think we need to hold on to when it comes to how we protect people seeking asylum and refugee status?
I thank you for that question. I think Fred's going to probably speak to that in a sense when he concludes our program. So we'll do that if that's okay. All right. I think we are at our time, unfortunately. Please corner Fred afterwards for additional questions. I want to thank all of you for being with us. We will have 2 more first-person programs this year, next Wednesday and Thursday. The museum's website will have information about our program when we resume in March of 2018. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So I'm going to turn it back over to Fred to close our program. When he's finished, I'd like to ask you to stay with us for a couple of moments when Fred's done, because Joel, our photographer, is going to come up on stage and take a photograph of Fred with you as the background. It makes for a great photograph for Fred. So please stick with us for that. And then we're going to try and get Fred up the aisle as quickly as possible so that he can sign copies of the Fred Kahn story. So, Fred.
Thanks God, I'm alive today because of good people who stood up to evil. To me, they personified the strength, the righteous strength of the human spirit. I have lived also personally an authentic, honest life for myself and others. Now I'll tell you why even I still have much hope in the human race. When my uncle turned me over to that lady that took me to the border by the name of Margaret, a lady he had never met before in his life. He was overcome by emotion, and I learned about that only long after the war, many years after. He thought, he had the thought that he may never, ever see me again. So he had on himself a very precious thing and asked the lady to make sure that if ever he would not survive, that she would make sure that she would get it, to keep it, and give it to me. And so today I finish the talk by showing you what he gave to her. A solid gold watch that she could have sold during the war or whatever. No, nobody knew that she had it. And after the war, she managed to get it to me, and here it is. And it was a repeated watch. Unfortunately, I cannot anymore open it, but you can hear it.
Put it up to your microphone.
Where's the microphone?
Right on your chest. Yeah.
Well, you do. Why don't you? Because I don't have the strength of my arm.
Okay.
You pushed on that,
Okay.
and it still works. No, push on the...
I don't think it's...
Did you hear it?
Ooh. There we go. That's terrific.
All right. And now that watch was given to that lady 79 years ago.
And she got it back to you after the war.
Right. I did not know, he probably took her aside, and I never knew about it until I received the package with it and a letter explaining why. And as I mentioned, she could have, no one knew that she had it. She safely, and I don't know her, except that after the war, according to my father, she worked for the British Army. And bless Mary Agor. She was a German. And just like the first boyfriend I had, Walter was German. And also I did not mention that we lived in a place where the landlady, before we went in hiding, was sort of German from the part of Germany that was given to Belgium after World War I, near Malmedy. And she arranged for my father to meet with next door to us, the man who was in charge of the German army in that town. And so they met, and he told us that as long as he was there, nothing would happen to our family, but he cannot guarantee what is after. And he told him, according to my father, between four eyes, get lost. And I would, if I would be in your case, or something to that effect. And that's another German who was not a Nazi. So you see, as a result of it, personally, I have nothing against the Germans, except naturally the murderers, who are, in some cases, sadists. And the more I learn about the Holocaust, through the managing the listserv, which I was asked to take over 15 years, which is on Yahoo, and there's 325 members from 5 different countries. And we go really dig into that. And of course, if I would encounter, I was an American soldier and I would encounter a German Nazi with the SS, I would probably kill him. That's it. And of course I continue preaching, making, my wife also, we are human rights activists in a way, not of any organization, but in our way. And one thing is, when I first came to the United States, I was shocked to find that discrimination occurred against people because of their skin color. Having survived because of my religion, and now I found out, so it probably in the back of my mind I decided never to look down on people because of the way they appear. And in fact, most of the time, I'm wrong when I pass a judgment on people. So that, and as a result of it, I became the vice president of the International Club at the University of Maryland, and out of it came my idea of presidential debates, and you know the rest about that if you buy that book.
Right. Thank you, Fred. Thank you.